I am 63 years old. I live alone now in a small house in St. Vital, Winnipeg, and most mornings I walk to the Tim Hortons 2 blocks over and sit with my coffee and watch people come and go, and I think about how different my life looks now compared to what it was supposed to be. I spent 22 years as an elementary school teacher. I have 2 daughters. I have a garden that gets too much sun in July and not nearly enough in September. I have a good life, a quiet life, a life that is entirely mine. What I didn't have for a long time was safety, and what I almost didn't have was my younger daughter, Cleo. Because her father tried to kill us both before she was ever born. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. From the outside, everything looked exactly right. My husband was a financial advisor at a firm in the downtown Exchange District. We had a nice house in the South End, a reliable car, a good neighborhood. Our older daughter was 3 years old and funny and round-cheeked and obsessed with a stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. I was 7 months pregnant. The kind of life that made people at dinner parties say things like, "You two have really figured it out." They had no idea. But before I tell you what happened that Thursday afternoon, before I describe his hands on me, the sound I made when I hit the wall, the blood, I need to tell you about his sister. Because she is the one who lit the match, and I need to tell you about Dr. Sandhu, my OB-GYN, who came into that hospital room and dismantled my husband in 3 sentences without ever raising her voice. I'll get to both, but let me take you back first. Let me take you back to before I understood what I had married. I met my husband at a mutual friend's Canada Day party 26 years ago. I was 37, which in those days felt late to unmissed in the way that only other people could make you feel. He was 41, divorced once, charming in a way that felt like warmth instead of performance. He'd grown up outside of Portage-la Prairie, moved to Winnipeg for work, had his own condo on Pembina, drove a decent car. He made me feel, at that party, like I was the most interesting person in the room. Looking back now, I know that's one of the things to watch for. Someone who makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room is often, ultimately, most interested in themselves. We dated for 11 months. We were married at a small ceremony at the Manitoba Club. I was 38. 4 months later, I was pregnant with our first daughter, and 2 months after that, I was pregnant again. A surprise, but a welcome one, we told people. A welcome one, I told myself, even on the evening when my husband stood in the kitchen and asked me if I thought it was really wise, given that I was already so tired all the time. That I wasn't exactly contributing the way I used to, financially. That was the first comment I should have named out loud. Looking back now, I can trace the whole map of what came after back to that single sentence. They come so small at first, so easy to explain away. By the time I was in my 3rd trimester with my younger daughter, I had learned to track my husband's moods the way you track weather. You learn the pressure changes. You learn which questions to avoid and which silences to fill and which silences to let breathe. I had learned all of it without ever consciously deciding to learn it. That is how it works. You adapt without realizing you have been forced to adapt. And one day you look up, and the person you were before you started adapting is someone you can barely remember. His sister Arlene came to stay with us for 2 weeks in early November. She'd had a falling out with her own husband. Her marriage was deteriorating in ways I didn't fully understand, and my husband insisted she come to Winnipeg while things settled. I didn't want her there. Every time Arlene visited, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way I felt in my chest before I could name it. She and my husband had a language of shared grievance that closed every room around them. I was never part of it. I came to understand, the subject of it. But I said yes. Of course I said yes. Saying no wasn't something I did easily anymore. The first week was manageable. Arlene kept mostly to herself, sat with her brother in the evenings, was polite to me in the way that contains a deliberate withholding. Not rude, just never quite warm. She never once asked how I was feeling, how the pregnancy was going, whether I needed anything. Our older daughter she treated like furniture. That bothered me more than anything else. The second week was different. It started with the nursery. I'd spent the better part of 2 months putting it together. The crib my husband and I had spent an entire Saturday assembling, the second-hand glider I'd reupholstered myself in a pale sage fabric, the mobile I'd ordered from a small shop in the Exchange. Soft yellows and greens because we didn't know yet if we were having a boy or a girl. It was mine. That room was mine in a way that almost nothing else in that house felt mine anymore. I had chosen everything in it with intention and care, and a love that felt, in those months, like the only uncomplicated thing left in my life. I came home from school on a Thursday afternoon and found Arlene in the nursery. She'd moved the glider to the wrong wall. She'd taken down the mobile I'd hung and replaced it with something from a bag she'd apparently brought with her from home, a plastic mobile with primary-colored shapes that looked as though it had survived 2 decades of garage sales. My mobile had been set on top of the dresser, not carefully, just set there like it didn't matter. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I said anything. I was 7 months pregnant. I was tired in the way that goes all the way into the bone, and I looked at that room and I felt something I still don't quite have a word for. Not simply anger, something closer to grief, like I had lost something before I had gotten a chance to hold it. I kept my voice level. I told her I appreciated that she was trying to help, but that I had everything arranged the way I wanted it, and I'd like to put it back. She turned around slowly. The way you turn around when you want someone to understand that you have been interrupted. She told me I was being ungrateful, that she'd raised 2 children, and I hadn't raised any yet, not a baby from the very beginning. That I clearly had no idea what a newborn actually needed, or I'd have recognized immediately that my mobile was a hazard, that the glider was positioned wrong relative to the window, that the entire room had been set up by someone thinking about aesthetics and not about the child. Each sentence was delivered with the patience of someone who has long since decided they are the only adult in the room. I told her, more firmly this time, that this was my daughter's room, and I was her mother, and I was asking her to please leave it exactly as I had it. She said something then that I won't repeat here. Something about what kind of mother lets her own preferences come before her baby's safety. Something designed to go in deep and stay there. And then I heard the front door. My husband came home to find his sister in the hallway and me standing outside the nursery with my hand over my stomach and tears running down my face. Not loud crying, the quiet kind. The kind that comes from somewhere too tired for noise. He didn't ask me what was wrong. He looked at his sister, and his sister began to talk. Whatever version of that afternoon she gave him, it was not the one I had lived through. He listened without looking at me, and I watched his face change the way I had watched it change before, but never quite this much, never this fast. His jaw set. His hands went still at his sides. Something went cold behind his eyes. He said very quietly that I owed his sister an apology. I told him I didn't. I told him I had asked her calmly to leave the nursery as I had arranged it, and she had spoken to me in a way I wasn't going to accept. He called me a word then. I'll leave it as a blank here, because what it was matters less than the fact that he said it to me, his pregnant wife, in front of his sister, who looked at the floor and said nothing. I told him to lower his voice. I told him I was 7 months pregnant and I needed him to lower his voice. He didn't lower his voice. He grabbed my arm, his hand around my upper arm, thumb pressing in hard, and I tried to pull back and my heel caught on the edge of the hallway runner and I went down. Not a stumble, down. My shoulder hit the wall on the way, and then I was on the floor, and the pain that moved through me was not just from the impact. It was the fear, the understanding, total and immediate, that my body was no longer only mine to protect. I heard myself saying the baby. I kept saying it. I couldn't stop. The baby, the baby. He stood over me, and his face held something I had never fully seen before. Though I understand now it had always been there behind the version of himself he chose to show me. Arlene was in the hallway. She didn't move. He kicked me once, the side of my hip, and then once more, lower. I curled around my stomach the way every instinct in my body told me to, arms wrapped around my belly, trying to make myself as small as possible while covering what mattered most. I was saying please. I don't think the words were coherent. I was just trying to reach something human in him. And then he stopped. I've never been able to explain why he stopped. I've turned it over in my mind for 25 years. Maybe Arlene said something. Maybe he scared himself. He stepped back and I could hear him breathing hard, and he looked at his hands with an expression I didn't understand at the time and understand now completely. I was bleeding, not heavily but enough to know that something was wrong. I told them to call an ambulance. Arlene picked up the phone. My husband knelt beside me and reached for my hand, and I pulled it away. I pulled it away and I didn't say anything because there was nothing left to say. I just needed to get to the hospital. I needed to know if my daughter was still alive inside me. The paramedics arrived within minutes. My husband stood in the doorway of the living room and told them I'd tripped on the hallway runner, that I hadn't been careful, that I'd been moving too fast, that the rug had been catching on feet for weeks. He constructed a complete and plausible story in under 30 seconds, right there in front of me, while I lay on a stretcher, and I said nothing. Because he was watching me, because Arlene was watching me, because I didn't know yet that I was allowed to tell the truth. The ambulance ride to the Health Sciences Center Women's Hospital was the longest 8 minutes I have ever lived through. I kept one hand on my stomach, and I counted movements. Every kick was a small mercy. She was still moving. I kept saying it to myself like a prayer. She is still moving. At the hospital, things moved quickly. Monitors, an ultrasound, a doctor who asked about the fall in a voice so carefully neutral it felt like a held breath. My husband had followed the ambulance. He stood in the corner of the room, answered questions, touched my arm, called me sweetheart. I stared at the ceiling. They told me the baby's heartbeat was there but irregular, that I was having early contractions, that they needed to administer medication to stop the labor, and I needed to stay absolutely still, and they needed to run more tests. A nurse came in to take my vitals. Then, about 20 minutes later, the door opened and Dr. Sandhu walked in. She was my OB-GYN. She'd been managing my prenatal care for 4 months. She came into that room, looked at the monitors, looked at my chart, looked at me, and then she looked at my husband. Something moved behind her eyes. I noticed it, but I didn't know yet what it meant. She went through the chart methodically. She asked the standard questions. She asked me to describe how the fall had happened. I described the fall. She nodded. She set down the clipboard. And then she said pleasantly that she would need to do a full physical examination given the level of trauma, and that standard protocol required her to photograph all injuries sustained in the 3rd trimester. She said, "In Manitoba, as a regulated health professional, I'm also a mandated reporter under the Child and Family Services Act. Anytime I document injuries on a pregnant patient that are consistent with physical trauma, I am required by law to file a formal report to Child and Family Services and to the Winnipeg Police. That process is not discretionary. It was triggered the moment I entered my preliminary findings into your chart. It's automatic. There is nothing I can do to stop it now, and nothing anyone else in this room can do either." She said it with the calm of someone reading out a bus schedule, and then she looked up. Her eyes went briefly and precisely to my husband, and I watched him go white. Not pale, white. The color left his face the way heat leaves a room when you open a window in January. His mouth opened slightly. Arlene, who had followed us to the hospital and was standing near the door, made a small sound. Neither of them spoke. Dr. Sandhu said, in the same tone, "The examination will take approximately 20 minutes. There's a family waiting area at the end of the hall on the left. Someone will come and get you when we're finished." It was not a question. It was not a request. It was said in the voice of someone who has run 1,000 rooms and knows exactly where every exit is. My husband looked at me once before he moved. I saw the warning in it. I saw the calculation. Dr. Sandhu saw it too. I know she did because the moment that door closed behind him, she was beside me and her voice had changed entirely. She said quietly, "Tell me what actually happened." I don't know exactly when I made the decision. I think I made it somewhere on that ambulance ride, counting kicks and thinking about what kind of world my daughter was going to come into if I kept doing what I'd been doing. I told Dr. Sandhu everything. The grab, the fall, the kick. Arlene standing in the hallway watching, the months before it, the walking on eggshells, the slow narrowing of everything until I couldn't see the edges of it anymore. She listened without writing anything down. When I finished, she said, "I want you to know that what I told your husband was true. Mandatory reporting in Manitoba is real, and the moment I document your injuries, the report is filed. The police will be notified." And then she said the thing I have thought about nearly every day for 25 years. "You didn't cause this, and you do not have to go back." She called security first. 2 officers stationed outside my door within minutes with instructions that my husband was not to re-enter under any circumstances. Then she made 2 calls, one to the Winnipeg police, one to the hospital's social work team. And then she conducted the most thorough examination I've ever experienced. She documented every bruise, every mark, every place, photographed everything. She explained each step before she did it, and she apologized each time she had to touch somewhere that hurt. The police came, 2 officers. They took my statement while Dr. Sandhu stayed in the room, not holding my hand but near it in the way that mattered. I told them everything, not just that night, the whole year, the pattern that I hadn't known I was living inside until someone gave me a room without him in it and asked me a direct question. The female officer told me that domestic assault against a pregnant woman carried enhanced charges under Manitoba law. That with my statement, the medical documentation, and the 911 call they had already received from my neighbor across the street, who had heard the screaming through a window neither of us had known was open, they had more than sufficient grounds to proceed. They went to find my husband in the waiting area. And that is when Arlene, in an effort to get ahead of the narrative, told the attending officer that I had provoked her brother. That she'd been staying with us all week and she'd seen the tensions. That she'd noticed bruises on my arm the previous day and hadn't thought much of it because she'd assumed I must have done something to bring it on myself. She did not realize she had just confirmed to a police officer that she had witnessed evidence of ongoing physical abuse and chosen to say nothing. Her statement was entered into the record. When the criminal proceedings began, the prosecutor called it one of the cleaner pieces of corroboration she'd received in years. My husband was arrested in the family waiting area of the Health Sciences Center Women's Hospital. He was charged with aggravated domestic assault on a pregnant woman. Arlene was not charged, but her statement followed my husband's case all the way to sentencing, and it followed Arlene herself into every family court proceeding that came after. My sister drove up from Brandon that night. She was there before midnight. She didn't ask me why I hadn't told her sooner. She just sat beside me in a chair she pulled close to the bed and held my hand until I fell asleep. They stopped the contractions. The bleeding slowed. By the following morning, the ultrasound showed everything the doctors needed to see. My daughter was still there, still holding on. Her heartbeat had stabilized. The doctor told me it was, given everything my body had been through, something close to remarkable. I stayed in hospital for 4 days. In that time, I learned that my husband had been denied bail, that an emergency protective order had been granted, that the Crown prosecutor on his file was not interested in plea arrangements, that Dr. Sandhu had stopped by my room every single day, which was not technically part of her responsibilities, but which was exactly the person she was. My daughter was born 6 weeks later. A planned induction at 39 weeks because my doctor wanted to control every variable she could. She arrived at 11:47 in the evening, screaming with everything she had, and when they placed her on my chest, I made a sound I had never made before in my life. Not crying exactly, something older, something that had been waiting a long time. I named her Cleo, a name I had loved since I was a teenager, a name that was entirely mine, that he had never suggested and had no claim on. He had taken a great deal from me. He was not taking that. The legal process took over a year. His lawyer tried every available avenue. Pregnancy hormones, mutual conflict. Arlene's account framed differently, character witnesses from the firm where he worked downtown. The prosecutor addressed each one. The judge was not moved. My husband was convicted of domestic assault causing bodily harm and sentenced to 14 months, to be followed by mandatory counseling, a no-contact order of indefinite duration, and supervised access only, subject to family court review that I had the legal right to contest at every stage. I contested it at every stage. The divorce was finalized when Cleo was 8 months old. I sold the house in the South End and bought a smaller one in St. Vital that was entirely mine. I went back to teaching the following September. I took my daughters to a child psychologist who specialized in family trauma. I went to therapy myself twice a week for the first year, then once a week, then monthly, for longer than I can easily count. I joined a support group at Osborne House that met on Tuesday evenings in a room with folding chairs and coffee that was never quite right and something that felt, against all odds, like safety. Those women. I cannot fully explain what those women were to me. Every one of them had a story that rhymed with mine in a different key. Every one of them was still standing. We celebrated each other's small victories with a kind of tenderness that I think can only exist in a room full of people who understand exactly how hard those small victories are to reach. My older daughter is 30 now. She lives in Ottawa and calls me every Sunday. My younger daughter, Cleo, is 25. She is a registered nurse. She works in emergency care at the Health Sciences Center. Yes, that hospital. The one where she spent the first 4 days of her life fighting to stay in the world. She does not yet know the full shape of what happened there before she was born. When she is ready to hear all of it, I will tell her. I will tell her that the hospital where she works every day is the place where Dr. Sandhu saved both of our lives with 3 sentences and a quiet, absolute certainty that I deserved better than what I was accepting. I met Dr. Sandhu for coffee 6 years after Cleo was born. We have stayed in touch ever since. She retired 3 years ago and has a garden in River Heights that she describes as too ambitious, which I believe completely. When I finally asked her about that night, specifically about what she had said to my husband about the mandatory reporting and the automatic process already being in motion, she smiled into her cup and told me that mandated reporting in Manitoba is entirely real. But the timeline she gave him, the immediacy, the idea that the process had already been triggered the moment she entered her findings into the chart. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. I may have described the automation involved with some generosity, she said. She had told my husband that the system had already closed around him, that there was no version of events in which his actions were not documented, no story he could construct that would alter what the authorities were already receiving. She had removed, in 3 sentences, his ability to control what happened next. And she had done it so calmly, so professionally, with so little visible effort that he had no room to push back without confirming exactly what he was. She outsmarted him. In a room where I had no power left, she walked in and redistributed it in under 2 minutes. If you are watching this and you see your own life in any part of what I've described, the tracking of moods, the carefully chosen silences, the explaining away of things that should not need explaining, I need you to hear me as directly as I know how. I was 63 years old before I could talk about this in public without my hands shaking. I spent years after leaving checking the locks twice each night. It took longer than I want to admit before I stopped apologizing for things I had not done wrong. But I am here, my daughters are here, we are genuinely fine. The crisis line for domestic violence in Manitoba is 1-877-977-0007. Canada's National Assaulted Women's Helpline is available around the clock. You can find shelter resources across the country at sheltersafe.ca. If he monitors your phone, you can clear your history after. You can use a phone at a library or a community center or a friend's house. The people on the other end of those lines will not judge you for how long it took you to call. If you are a healthcare worker and you are reading this, you have more tools available to you than you may realize. Dr. Sandhu did not save my life with extraordinary resources. She saved it with her knowledge of the law, her read of the room, and a decision she made in seconds to use everything available to her to protect a patient who could not yet protect herself. You may never face a room exactly like that one. But if you do, you will know what to do. Leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if any part of this reached you. I read everyone. My name doesn't matter as much as this does. 25 years ago, in a hospital room in Winnipeg, a doctor looked at me and told me I didn't have to go back. I believed her. That is the whole story. That is all of it.